Welcome back to Mediocre Sports Talk, courtesy of Daniel Marino. Today there will be no guest. You're stuck with just me. But I'll be mainly talking about Toronto sports. So if that's not the kind of thing you're into, probably not the episode for you. But I'm assuming most of the people who listen to this are into Toronto sports, so it should be a fun show. When I say Toronto sports, I mean we'll mainly be talking about the Toronto Raptors and Toronto Blue Jays. Kind of a different tune than the one that we were talking about last week when we were talking about the Patrick Marleau signing for the Toronto Maple Leafs and all the good stuff there. This will be a little bit more negative, but it is what it is. It's the direction of the teams in the city right now. The theme today will be rebuilding, and when you should and when you shouldn't. And it's important for Toronto fans that aren't used to teams that are good, quite frankly, to realize that if they want consistent success from their sports teams, that they're going to have to rebuild every once in a while. And the Leafs are actually a perfect example of why that is, right? The Leafs refused to rebuild properly for years, and because of that, they were terrible for years, right? Pretty much most of my lifetime, they've been one of the worst teams in all of sports, North American sports, right? And it's because they refused to rebuild when it was clear that they were not the team they used to be and they were aging. Instead of just rebuilding, they tried to take a shortcut and hand out big contracts to guys who probably didn't deserve it, and you saw where it brought them. So the first team I want to talk about is the Toronto Raptors. The Toronto Raptors, as I've said many times, I said this before they signed these two, and I've said it ever since they did. Signing Kyle Lowry and Serge Ibaka means that they have to be all in right now, right? By signing those two guys, you're saying we believe that we can compete with Cleveland and Golden State and all those teams right now. Because, look at what they were looking at there. If you let Lowry and Ibaka walk, or at least just Lowry, you save a ton of cap space, because right now they're kind of in cap hell, right? You let them walk, you save a ton of cap space, and you're able to start piling on for the next generation, right? They have a very capable core of young players that they've built through the last few drafts. And I'm going to talk about that a little more near the end of this segment. But they have a very capable core of young players that'll take over the next generation. So I think that maybe that's why they felt more comfortable taking the risk and not rebooting it right now and just rebuilding around DeRozan. But letting Lowry walk, and especially if you let Lowry and Ibaka walk, means you save a lot of money to extend the young guys in the future and bring on guys later on when those young guys are ready to compete. That's not what they did. And it's not something again, I said it from the beginning, I probably would have let them walk as much as it would have killed to see a guy like Lowry walk who kind of rejuvenated basketball in Toronto and in Canada, really. I know it's like the Lowry and DeRozan show, but DeRozan was there when they were bad, and Lowry coming in is what really turned the team around, right? So Lowry is the biggest reason that we went from basketball meaning nothing in the city, to be completely honest, to, the whole We the North thing, right? Yes, I know Drake is behind a lot of that as well, but they need to be successful for something like that to catch on. That's what Lowry represents. Lowry is what represents the last 4 years of making the playoffs every year, winning the division almost every year, going to the conference finals for the first time, winning a series in back-to-back years for the first time. Just generally, the most successful period of Toronto Raptors basketball came when Kyle Lowry was acquired and joined up with DeRozan. So as much as it would have killed to let a guy like that walk, I personally would have done it. Just because I don't. You look at the team right now. They re-signed Lowry, they re-signed Ibaka. Can you honestly tell me they're in any way close to Cleveland? There was some optimism when they lost to Cleveland 2 years ago in the conference finals. I mean, it was their first conference finals, so even if they got swept, there would have been some optimism. But the fact that they actually got there, took on a team like Cleveland with a guy like LeBron, who was dead set on winning another championship and finally bringing gold home for Cleveland. And, you know, I think that series wasn't as close as people think it was. Because I think Toronto fans kind of hang their hat on the fact that it went to 6 games. But if you look at the games, they got smacked the first 2 games. They came back and kind of smacked Cleveland the third game. The fourth game was close and they won. And then the last 2, they got smacked even worse than the first 2. Right? Only 1 game in that entire series was close. That's one of the 2 that the Raptors won. And I think Cleveland just kind of took their foot off the gas. But it was still impressive. They still went 6 games with Cleveland, a team that was literally just coasting into the finals, that swept the first 2 rounds of the playoffs. And Toronto took them to 6 games in their first ever conference finals. They were 1 game short of a do-or-die game with LeBron James and stopping him from going to his 6th straight, at the time, NBA Finals appearance. 1 game short of doing that. So even though I don't think it was as close as people say it was, there was a reason to be optimistic. You were 2 games away from winning the finals. You were 2 games away from being the best team in the East and having a shot at winning the championship. Now, all we need to do is build on that, and if you improve on that, there's no reason to believe that you're not, you didn't do enough to overcome Cleveland and have a real shot at winning a championship. Last season was a much different feeling at the end of it. Not only did they go through some rough patches, not only did they absolutely refuse to... Cleveland kind of offered the East on a silver platter to Toronto, and Toronto turned it down for some reason. I'm not trying to, doubt the Boston Celtics and Isaiah Thomas and all that, but realistically, if the Boston Celtics played the Toronto Raptors last year in the playoffs, does anyone really think Boston would have won? Because I have a hard time believing it. Toronto owned them all the regular season, right? I have no doubt in my mind Toronto was a better team last year, and if they played in the playoffs, they would have beat Boston. However, that doesn't matter because neither team was going to beat Cleveland, despite Cleveland coming in second, right? But, the fact that Cleveland was, when you say coasting, they were probably playing at 50% effort all regular season and still came in second. And considering they did that and Toronto just kept shooting themselves in the foot, losing games where they should have won, going on these weird losing streaks, Toronto had the East. They had a very, very, very good chance of winning the Eastern Conference and being able to kind of walk into a series with Cleveland, probably in the conference finals where they would have home court advantage, right? And I don't think it would have changed anything, but still, that was kind of like them not taking advantage of that and actually faltering and coming in 3rd place was kind of the first sign to fans, I think, that said, this team's still not ready. And the scary thing is that they were actually better. They did improve, right? They still had pretty much the same team, except they traded for Serge Ibaka, which was a huge boost. He became your starting power forward. What did you give up for Ibaka? You gave up Terrence Ross. Now, a big part of why the Raptors struggled near the end of the season is they didn't have a true three-point shooter, which is what Terrence Ross was for them coming off the bench. But still, the trade-off between Terrence Ross and Serge Ibaka is, come on. Ibaka is your starting power forward. He's one of the best power forwards in the NBA right now. He's experienced. He's been around for a long time. He's played in the NBA Finals against LeBron, right? He's been on some damn good teams. He's elite defensively, which is something that the Raptors needed even more than a three-point shooter last year, was someone who could play defensively. He's not a great three-point shooter, but for a guy his size and that plays the way he does, he's a good three-point shooter for what he is, right? And he can drive the paint. So that was a huge improvement bringing in Ibaka. Then their biggest free agent signing was Jared Sullinger, and they swap him for PJ Tucker, which is another huge improvement. I think Patrick Patterson's play obviously declined last season, which is weird because it was a contract season for him. He had to prove that he was worth the money. It seemed like he was going to get a big pay raise this year, and he never got it because he struggled last year, right? Most guys rise up in the last year of their contract in order to max out on their earnings for the year after. Obviously, lock up a nice long-term contract. I mean, you see it especially in the NBA. Some of these bench players are getting paid ridiculous amounts of money, and I thought for sure Patterson was going to do the same thing, but he struggled last year. But Sullinger not playing and then being able to swap him for Tucker more than made up for Patterson. Tucker was so good, especially at the end of the season. Again, elite defensively and a good three-point shooter. He was so good that he was an improvement despite Patterson getting worse. He was enough to make up for Patterson getting worse and then some. So the team was better. Even their young guys were better. Like DeLon Wright was contributing. He obviously wasn't going to see a lot of minutes in the playoffs unless Lowry gets hurt, which is what happened, but they were a better team. They go into this series with Milwaukee, and it's like, oh my God, the same shit all over again. They lose game 1 to Milwaukee. And they go down 2-1. It's like, oh my God, this team just cannot perform in the playoffs. They're too inconsistent in the play. All season they win these games that they should win because they're one of the top 3 teams in the East. And then playoffs start, and it's like they can't string more than 2 wins together. And I know, okay, it's the playoffs, it's a best-of-7 series, it's not supposed to be easy to do that, but in a sport where the top teams constantly either sweep the team they're facing in the first round or win in 5 games, maximum 6, the fact that Toronto always has to go to 7 games when they're the top seed or loses, it's worrisome, right? Anyway, they rebound with winning 3 games in a row and finally winning their first series without it needing to go to a do-or-die game. And it kind of restores that confidence a little bit. Because this is DeRozan's, by far, his best performance, like his best playoff performance ever. He's playing like this, the regular season DeRozan in the playoffs. Lowry, as per usual with Lowry, was inconsistent. But DeRozan was great. So, that little hope that you had is restored. They go into Cleveland, get smacked the first 2 games. Lowry gets hurt, and they end up getting swept. Now, for the record, I think if Lowry didn't get hurt, it probably still would have ended in a sweep. I don't think that's... Maybe they win 1 game. Maybe 2. But there's no way they win the series. And there's no way they improve on last year and force it to 7 games. Like, the bottom line is that they were just not good enough to compete with Cleveland, and not the way that it was the year before. The year before, they go to Game 6 with Cleveland when they're not expected to even put up a fight. They're going to get swept, all that crap. And, in their first ever conference finals, they push LeBron a little bit. They push the Cavaliers a little bit. And they force it to Game 6, and they lose. This year, they have to meet them in the second round because they kind of faltered in the regular season. They didn't play as well as they could have. And when they do end up playing Cleveland, they get swept. So there's no reason to be optimistic because they did improve on the season before, and all they got was a worse result. Even if you think what's the difference between losing in the third round and the second round, which I agree with, they play the same team, and instead of, pushing back, they got swept. There was nothing to be optimistic about at the end of the season. So that's why I'm saying I would have blown it up because I thought I made it pretty clear that there's just nothing they can do to match Cleveland right now. And I'm not saying just don't do anything, but, rebuild. Because there's just not enough cap space right now for them and not enough players who are interested in creating a super team in Toronto, right? So that's why I would have done it. But they re-signed Lowry and Ibaka. Not something I'm upset about. That's something that I think is necessarily stupid. I think they were in a position where either way you can make an argument for what they did. But now they're here, and they're still nowhere close to Cleveland. Because again, with Lowry and Ibaka on the team last year, they got swept by Cleveland in the second round. So they're not beating Cleveland. I don't know. Let's break down their offseason. Let's really. I've had a lot of people asking me, are they a better team right now than they were at the end of the season? Because obviously re-signing Lowry and Ibaka doesn't mean that, but they have made some moves. So let's talk about what happened. The Raptors traded DeMarre Carroll, a first-round pick, and a second-round pick to the Brooklyn Nets. I believe the guy that they traded for, Hamilton, he's a center. I believe they're just releasing him or something. So it was literally just a cap dump. What happened with DeMarre Carroll? A few years ago, the Raptors' biggest offseason move was signing Carroll. He was supposed to be part of the reason that they would push past the first round of the playoffs. If you remember, the first year they made it with Lowry and DeRozan, they were a 3 seed against the 6 seed Nets, actually. They ended up losing in Game 7, but it was their first time in the playoffs and since the Bosch era. It's the first time for Lowry and DeRozan together. So there's reason to be optimistic. The next year they get swept by the Wizards in the first round as the 4 seed. So it's like, yeah, right? This was supposed to be the year that we pushed into the second round, maybe in the conference finals, because the Eastern Conference is weak. It has been for a while. So one of the big moves they made in that offseason was signing DeMarre Carroll. And DeMarre Carroll was supposed to offer them elite defensive output that could shoot threes. Just basically a two-way player. He earned the contract by playing well in the playoffs for the Hawks. He was supposed to be a quote-unquote LeBron stopper. Is that what you say? I don't know. He was there to defend LeBron, pretty much. If you're in the East, you almost have to sign someone who can defend LeBron. Because if you want to be a good team, you're going to have to lose to LeBron at some point. So they give him this big contract. I was talking to John the other day about, he was saying how people were saying, not really blaming Masai Ujiri for the signing, saying that at the time it sounded like a good signing and stuff like that. When they signed Carroll, I'll admit that I didn't think it was a bad signing. They gave him a lot of money, but most free agents get overpaid. And for how he performed in the years prior, it seemed like it was a perfect fit. Like I said, they needed help defensively. Carroll gave them that. He was going to be their starting small forward. They needed a starting small forward, so he was going to be their starting small forward, play well defensively, and again, could hit threes, give you some offensive output as well. But when you hand over that much money to a guy like that, you have to be sure it's going to work out. And it's not like it just didn't work out. It's not like there were flashes of him being what the team needed him to be, or he was good at first and his play declined. This is a disaster. This is a complete disaster. I love Masai, but this was by far the worst move that he's made. For the Raptors head office. Having to trade your entire draft next year just to get rid of a guy, it's embarrassing. The DeMarre Carroll signing is a complete disaster. He struggled to stay healthy. He was not nearly as good defensively as advertised. He was getting bullied in the playoffs when he played. Then offensively, he was horrible, especially the first season. He missed I think half of his first season with the Raptors, and when he came back, he was pretty decent offensively. He didn't play nearly as many minutes as he was supposed to be because he was coming back from injury. But my God, this past year was just brutal, especially in the playoffs. He couldn't hit anything. It got to the point where it didn't matter how open he was, you did not want him to shoot because you knew he was going to miss. Complete disaster. Again, you had to trade your entire draft next year just to dump his salary. It could not have had a worse ending. After 2 years of below mediocre play. So there's the Tamari Carroll trade. What other moves did they make? They traded Corey Joseph for C.J. Miles, which I think is a big improvement for the team. Kojo, as much as it sucks for Raptors fans, and I understand if people are upset, Corey Joseph's from Pickering. He's from around the corner, you know what I mean? He's from Ontario, so you don't want to. You want that guy to play for you, especially when he's as good as Kojo is. But at the end of the day, Kyle Lowry re-signing was the end of the end of the deal for Kojo in Toronto. There was no room for him anymore, right? This improves the team regardless of the skill of either player. Even if they were the exact same skill level, it's an improvement for Toronto because, again, there was no more room for Corey Joseph, right? Who is C.J. Miles? C.J. Miles is an excellent three-point shooter. He shot above 40% from beyond the arc last season. And as I've been saying, a three-point threat is something that they've needed since they traded Terrence Ross. So that's what Miles brings to them. He's an above-average three-point shooter. So they finally have someone to replace that since Terrence Ross has left. I still think they need someone else that can shoot threes, but for the time being, they've kind of remedied that quite a bit. I've been reading up on him all morning, and I've seen people call him an elite three-point shooter. I've seen a lot of people not say that, but from what I'm gathering, he's a borderline elite three-point shooter as a small forward. And that's the other thing, his versatility is going to help out a lot. Miles will most likely, as of right now, he's probably your starting small forward. He'll split a lot of time with Norman Powell. So either he's your starting small forward, or he can come off the bench and give you a little kick off the bench to replace Powell. I think they'll have very similar minutes. But yeah, he can be your three-point shooter off the bench, which is big. But he's also able to play shooting guard. Even though he's 6'6", one of the big things that I kept seeing in a bunch of scouting reports about Miles is that when he plays shooting guard, he uses his large frame to take advantage of smaller defenders at shooting guard, right? So when DeRozan needs a rest, it's almost guaranteed that Miles will be the shooting guard. And he'll be able to not replicate DeRozan's offensive output, but it'll be a suitable replacement. The fact that you have this guy who can consistently hit threes while DeRozan rests and Powell plays small forward. Defensively, he's very capable. That's what I kept reading. Nowhere near the elite defensive talent that the Raptors probably need at this point. But especially when he's beside guys like Ibaka, he can hold his own, right? From what I read, he'll have spurts where if they need to lean on him defensively, he won't score a bunch, but he'll be able to lock guys down a bit. I mean, not like a LeBron stopper or anything. They don't really have that on the team right now. But he's one of those guys where he can go both ways. So if you have DeRozan and Lowry on, and they're scoring for you, he can kind of take a step back and focus on his defense. And when he does that, he's very good defensively. And then when guys like DeRozan are off and he needs to score to kind of fill the void with DeRozan not out there, he can do that, but his defense will suffer. So he sounds like a pretty good replacement for P.J. Tucker. He's worse defensively, or much less consistent defensively, but he's much better offensively. Especially the P.J. Tucker that we saw in the playoffs, who out of nowhere couldn't hit threes. So like I said, Kojo was great for the Raptors. He was, I don't know what an elite backup is. I hear that a lot. But if there were an elite backup for a position, Kojo was an elite backup point guard. Oh my god, I almost said quarterback. Point guard. Right? I don't really believe in elite backups, but he's the best that you can get at point guard coming off the bench. He's good enough to start, but not good enough to start on a contender. Right? He's not good enough to be the Raptors' starting point guard if they want to keep competing in the East. Like, if he was their starting point guard this year because they let Lowry walk, it would be more as a stopgap, so that all the minutes wouldn't go to DeLon Wright just yet. But he wouldn't be the point guard of the future. The second they're ready to compete, he would have got shipped off. So right when they re-signed Lowry, it became pretty obvious that Kojo was going to be used as trade bait. They played it well. They played it well. It's clear that if they want to compete, they're going to have to make some moves. There was no one in free agency really that would have been worth pursuing for the Raptors that they could have realistically got that would have closed that gap between them and Cleveland. So if they're going to close that gap, it's going to have to come through the trade market. And again, once you re-sign Lowry, Kojo became one of your biggest trade pieces because on many teams he's very valuable. He can be a starting point guard on many teams in the NBA. And for teams that are just looking to, for teams that are already at, a high level, he could be a great backup. You need depth. Every team needs depth. And Kojo gives you depth because he's a great backup point guard. Again, good enough to start on a lot of teams. But there's just no room for him in Toronto because you have Lowry, who's clearly better. Lowry's an all-star. He's the starting point guard. And then you have DeLon Wright. And DeLon Wright is ready for more minutes, right? DeLon Wright is ready now to step into that backup role so that he can blossom further under Lowry, get more minutes the next few seasons until he takes over for Lowry as a starting point guard, which is most likely what will eventually happen, especially if he keeps improving the way he has already. Because he's shown some very small bursts of what we can see in the future. There's a lot of potential in DeLon Wright. And that's why Corey Joseph's trade value was so high, is that he didn't belong on the Raptors anymore. They don't get worse now that they've traded him because DeLon Wright will replace his productivity. And again, DeLon Wright has so much upside. He's so young that the hope is that he doesn't only replace Kojo's productivity, but he actually improves it. But there's a lot of teams that could use a guy like Corey Joseph. So even if skill for skill, player for player, Corey Joseph was better than CJ Miles, which I'm not sure if that's the case, it's an improvement because you gave away a guy that you didn't need, you had no room for him on the team, and you brought in someone who fits the team and fits their needs. They needed a starting small forward. I don't know if he is their starting small forward, but worst case scenario, if they don't add any more small forwards, it's either CJ Miles or Norman Powell. But if you're not comfortable with Powell being the starter just yet, you have a guy who could completely split the minutes with him, like 50-50. And again, they needed a three-point shooter, and they got it with Miles, whether he's off the bench or in the starting lineup. So those are the two major moves that they've made. Now you have to ask yourself, is the team better? Okay? Like I said, the Miles trade improves them. The only significant players they've lost through free agency are Patrick Patterson and PJ Tucker, and obviously that's going to hurt. You've lost some depth off the bench. Even though Tucker wasn't there for long, for when he was there, he improved the team, right? Patterson struggled last year, but again, I don't really believe there's many players in the NBA that you can lose and improve, right? I mean, there is one, that's DeMarre Carroll, but we'll get into that a little later. No, you don't really improve by losing Carroll. Your cap space just improves. You don't get worse, but whatever. But losing Patterson and Tucker is going to hurt. So how do you replace their productivity? Well, they're going to have to increase minutes for some of the younger players, right? Podol will probably see a nice increase in minutes. As most Raptors fans know, he's a very safe player with... Basically, his thing is that he has a high basketball IQ. Despite being a rookie last year, he was... One thing rookies have trouble with when they first come into the league is their defense, right? It takes a little while to get used to the NBA speed and the quality of players that you're playing against, so defense is something that's usually a struggle for rookies, but he was much better than people expected defensively last year. he doesn't have a ton of upside for a player that young, especially offensively. But the way Patterson struggled last year, I think that more minutes for Podol and another year of experience, another year of improvement, will be an improvement for the team. Swapping out Patterson for Podol, right? Not a huge improvement, but it could be. I think worst case Ontario, swapping Patterson for Podol for more minutes for Podol, is just even. Worst case Ontario. Because Patterson couldn't hit anything last year. He's not a true 3-point shooter. You also have, oh man, I'm going to struggle with some of these names. You also have Bruno Caboclo. I don't know, that name actually isn't that hard to say. It's one of those ones I struggle with. And he has much more upside, right? If guys like him and Podol can live up to their potential, again, Podol, oh my god, that name's starting to sound weird. Podol's upside isn't massive, but or his potential isn't massive, but if he lives up to it, it'll be an improvement over Patterson. Bruno has a lot of potential. I mean, the Raptors 905, or the Toronto 905, whatever, showed last year that the Raptors have a deep core of young talent. They have a lot of guys that are still developing and are almost ready to really contribute in the NBA. I mean, no like real superstars. I'm not saying they have a bunch of Paul Georges and Kevin Durant's down there, but they have a bunch of guys who can really provide them with depth. That's more or less the point I'm trying to prove here. If you want to talk about if the Raptors improve this offseason, trading Kojo for Miles was an improvement, and losing Patterson and Tucker means you lost some depth there, but the fact that their young guys have now had another year to improve means that they'll kind of fill the void depth-wise. So even though you didn't add anyone to replace Tucker and Patterson, the fact that those young guys have improved and will have more minutes this year means that you'll likely replace the productivity that you've lost, right? Or you'll at least close the gap a bit. Like I said before, losing Damari Carroll does nothing but for the team. You will not see a difference on the court with Carroll leaving besides more minutes for players that aren't Carroll, which, if anything, is an improvement. Carroll did not make this team better. Him leaving does not make the team worse, in my opinion, because he wasn't that good defensively, nearly as good as he was advertised. He was horrible offensively, and he had a massive contract. So they got rid of that contract, but you won't. I don't think you'll see a difference in the court besides the increase in minutes for guys like Norm Powell. Then you have the rookie. You have OG. Anunoby. We're gonna call him OG. OG, who tore his ACL in January. So the big thing with him, like future-wise, he'll obviously be producing in the next few years. But if you want to talk about this season, most rookies, especially that are drafted as late as he was, don't produce for on a professional level in the rookie season. But all I've read about this guy is how he is ready to he's pro ready. You know what I mean? The only way he won't be able to produce this season, from what I've seen, is if he's not healthy enough. If he doesn't come back in time, or if he's the ACL is still bothering him or whatever. But this guy has, from what I've seen, the potential to be elite defensively. Not just good, like an elite defensive player. From what I've read, actually, he reminds me a lot about Serge Ibaka. And if he can play like Serge Ibaka, that's huge for the Raptors, right? So even though it's his rookie season, the fact that everyone keeps saying his work ethic, his game speed, his basketball IQ is high enough that he can actually produce in his rookie season, again, if he's healthy enough, then he'll actually improve the team after the loss of Tucker and Patterson, but with the increased minutes for Powell and other young players, right? Especially because he can play multiple positions. They can even, again, if he's good enough this year, he could be a guy off the bench who can play small forward or even start, right? Now, I doubt it'll get to that level, but it'll be interesting to see his progression this year in his rookie season. So at the end of the day, are they better or are they worse than last year? I would say they're better. They didn't lose too much. I mean, they were going to lose 4 guys. They re-signed the 2 that would have significantly made them worse, Ibaka and Lowry. They lost, Patterson, who was really struggling last season. In past seasons, he gave them a spark off the bench, but he wasn't. He's not one of those players that you lose sleep over losing. Tucker was very good at the end of the season, kind of struggled offensively in the playoffs, but, he's someone that they'll definitely miss, but I think they have so many young guys that are probably ready to contribute a lot more than they have in the past this year. I haven't even gone over all of them, and that have only improved after one off season, that they'll replace that production, and especially if you couple that with OG potentially having a good rookie season. This is a guy who, again, from what I've read, he should have been drafted in the top 10. He ends up falling to 23 to the Raptors because of his ACL tear, right? This is a guy who could break out this year, and if he does, I would definitely say they've improved this year. And that being said, they've improved, but not nearly enough. If they want to compete with Cleveland, we're talking about them maybe improving. We're talking about them most likely improving, but ever so slightly. Like they've slightly improved. So I don't think they're done making moves. When they signed Lowry and Ibaka, this team said, we are ready to be competitive right now. Not next year, not the year after. We've had 4 straight years of making the playoffs. We've had an Eastern Conference Finals appearance. We've won 3 series in the last 2 years. We are ready to compete right now. And the East is weak. That's another thing that I think went into their decision to stay, not to stay competitive, but, to really commit to this team right now and re-sign Lowry and Ibaka, is that, I keep asking, is this team ready to compete right now if they re-sign Lowry and Ibaka? Well, you look around the East, and there's no one that really scares you besides Cleveland. And for the first time since LeBron got back to Cleveland, they're not really, he's not recruiting anyone. He's not actively going out there and trying to pile on as much talent to his team, grab as many veterans who will take a discount as possible in order to get them over the hump against Golden State. He's not doing that this year. He's not doing that because I think this is another topic for another day, but I think he's kind of sick with Cleveland head office, and a month ago I would have never said this, but I really do think this coming year is his last year in Cleveland. I think he's going to split again, because I really think that they pissed him off when they fired David Griffin. This, again, either he's giving up on beating Golden State, like he just said, there's no way I can compete with that team this year without creating another super team, and there'll be an asterisk beside my championship win anyway, because it won't be about him, right? If he brings on Paul George, and if they traded for Chris Paul or something like that, like they made another super team, they beat Golden State, it wouldn't be just about LeBron anymore. And for him to really challenge Jordan, especially now that his finals record is 3-5, he's gotta be the guy, right? So maybe that's it, or maybe again, he's just sick of Cleveland's front office for this, again. They drove him out the first time, and maybe he's just gonna, give this season a go, but he's not recruiting anyone because he's not there for the long run anymore, and he'll split next year, and Cleveland will be crap again. But who knows? I don't know. All I'm trying to say is the East is weak. There's only one team to be scared of. It's Cleveland, and for the first time in years, they're not really, adding a bunch of guys. All they've really done, as far as I can tell, is re-sign Kyle Korver. They're in cap hell, so that probably goes into it as well. And they've pursued. There's been reports of them pursuing a trade involving Kevin Love, like trading off Kevin Love, and I guess they did try to trade for Paul George, but again, none of that's confirmed, so we don't really know. They can't even land a general manager right now. Every second day, I'm getting an update about who's pulling out, who doesn't want the job anymore. So the East is weak. The Raptors are, as of this moment right now, after re-signing Ibaka and Lowry, they're still a top 4 team in the East at worst. Like, they're probably the second or third best team in the East, at worst fourth. You have Cleveland, who's clearly the best. Then you have Boston, Washington, Miami. Those are the only teams that Toronto really has to compete with. Everyone after that is like, you can't beat those teams and you're not in it. You know what I mean? Especially now that the 7th seed and the 8th seed from last year's playoffs in the East just traded off their own, like their star. When you're a 7 or 8 seed that has a star like Paul George or Jimmy Butler, there's a pretty good chance that you're very reliant on that guy. Like, those 2 teams aren't playoff teams next year. So there's 5 good teams in the East right now. 5 worthwhile teams. Boston, I think, might be slightly better than Toronto right now. Toronto was better than them last year, but this year they've added Gordon Hayward, and I think that's enough probably to put them over Toronto. But I don't think it would take much for Toronto to, overcome Boston again. I wouldn't be, if Boston and Toronto played in the playoffs this year, I would not be shocked if Toronto won. And if they add anyone else, I would probably put them above Boston again. Same with Washington, same with Miami, but those are 2 pretty good teams as well. But despite that, saying that they're probably the second or third best team in the East, the end goal is not a conference finals. It's not to be the second best team in the East. They've been to the conference finals before. The end goal right now is to go to the finals. It's to win a championship. I mean, that's the end goal of every season, but at least 2 years ago when they made their first conference finals, it was like, we just need to show that we can improve, that we can make a deep run in the playoffs, that we can win a series, that we can, take LeBron on, head on. But, they've done that now. Now they need to win. I mean, win the East, go to the finals, win a championship. That's the only thing left right now. They have to be all in. And again, if they want to be all in, they're not good enough right now. And they're going to have to add some people. And it's not going to be through free agency, because there's no one in free agency that would improve their team nearly enough to compete with Cleveland. And it's gonna be tough if that's what they're gonna try to do. Again, this is another reason why I probably wouldn't have re-signed Lowry. Re-signing Lowry and Ibaka means they're all in, but they don't have a lot of cap space. I mean, they had to trade a first and second round pick next year just to get rid of DeMar Carroll. They got nothing in return. They just got rid of one player so they can save up some cap space, because that signing was a freaking disaster. So when you're talking about improving, the fact that you don't have a lot of cap space to take on a star's contract, and the fact that you had to give up both of your draft picks next year, that's going to hurt. Because when you make a trade for a big-time player, you want to put a package together to avoid, you want to avoid trading anything that's going to... When you're a team like Toronto, when you make a trade like that, you're trying to significantly improve your team. So trading a good player for a good player, like if I trade a B-plus player for an A-minus player, I just got slightly better. That's not what you want to trade like this. You want to get significantly better. And the only way to do that is to trade stuff like draft picks and prospects, stuff that don't make you good right now, but will be an incentive enough for the team you're trading to, because they'll make that team better in the future. Right? It's the promise. They no longer have a first or second round pick next year. I'm not sure if they have any that came in trades, but it's definitely not a first round pick. It would be like a second round pick. So what do they have that they can trade to improve their team right now? Well, the obvious thing right now is, now that Kojo's gone, would be Jonas Valanciunas. I love Valanciunas. I think he's a good player. And he's a good center in the NBA, but he's not meant for this era. Like, at the end of the day, and I've talked about this before, Valanciunas is not athletic enough to defend the smaller centers in today's NBA. Today's NBA has a lot of centers that are smaller maybe than the old ones, or if they aren't smaller, they have to be as athletic as the guys that are smaller than them. And Valanciunas is not that. He's a very old style center. So it's very hard for him to compete and be consistently productive, both defensively and offensively. He's a good shooter for a center, and that helps. But again, he's not offensive, or he's not athletic enough to defend those guys inside, and he's not athletic enough to, let's say he becomes a three-point shooter. He's not athletic enough to fake the three and then drive the paint, or take the three and when they back up, shoot the three. He's not athletic to do that, so it's not as useful, right? So while, again, I think he's a good player, he's not good enough right now to make this team good enough to compete with Cleveland. He can help some teams. That's why he's a good trade piece. That's what I'm trying to say. He's a good player. But he's not the superstar that he could have been, that he had the potential to be. If they trade him, they don't necessarily need a center in return, right? They don't need someone to. They don't need the person that they trade back or to trade for to be someone who fills in at center. Because then at the end of the day, they're probably not going to give you someone that's better than Valanciunas, because that wouldn't make sense on their part. You have guys that can play center if you trade Valanciunas. If you trade Valanciunas for someone at a different position, you can put Podol at center. You could put Nogueira at center. But if you do either of those, the return better be significant, right? Because going from Valanciunas starting to Nogueira starting, or Podol at his current state, I mean, maybe Podol gets better, but maybe he gets a lot better. But right now, it doesn't look like, or there's no guarantee that he would be that much better. So if you're going to get that much worse at center, you better have gotten a lot better at a different position. Like, not just a depth guy. You better have gotten someone who's good enough that's, like, let's say you get a small forward. You better have gotten someone who's better than Powell or Miles and Valanciunas in a big enough way that it replaces all of that production. You know what I'm saying? You can also put, if you get like a good small forward, you could put Ibaka at center. So he's not obviously a traditional center. He's not big enough to be one. But then you can have a really stellar like starting five, right? You trade for a good small forward or a good power forward. You trade for a good power forward, you put Ibaka at center. Then you have five really good players, right? Someone who's better than Ibaka or slightly worse. But you need to get a good return if you're going to trade a starter like Valanciunas on a team that's ready to compete for a championship. So Valanciunas is your biggest trade piece. Then you have to think, like, you can't just trade Valanciunas. I don't think they're going to be looking at trading a lot of draft picks right now, just because, like I said, they don't have an entire draft next year. It helps that they have a good young core that'll prime them for the future so they can take a draft year off, but you don't want to be trading your next two drafts, right? So I don't see them trading a lot of draft picks, but they can't just trade Valanciunas. So a lot of the young guys will have to be put up for trade as well. All the guys that I've talked about, including Powell. They're the future, but you have enough of them right now that you can afford to spare one, maybe two. Probably not two, or just one. But if it improves you enough right now, if you get the right offer with a Valanciunas and one of those young guys, then you have enough for the future already that you can afford to lose those guys to improve right now. But yeah, if they want to improve, and they should, I mean, by signing Lowry and Ibaka, as I've said maybe 15 times on this podcast today, they have committed to competing right now. They have committed to being better than Cleveland right now, this season, and pushing for a championship this season. And that's not going to be easy. There's a lot of good teams in the NBA right now. They're like the 10th favorite to win the NBA championship this year. Like, look how much better the West got. Would you take Toronto in a series against Cleveland? No. Against Boston? Maybe. Against anyone else in the East? Probably, but I wouldn't be shocked if they lost to Miami or Washington. Would you take them against Golden State? Hell no. Would you take them against Houston? Hell no. Right? It's not just Cleveland or just Cleveland Golden State. They're going to have to improve significantly if they want to compete for a championship this year, and they're not ready right now. So if they want to do it, they're going to have to trade Valanciunas and a young guy or two. It won't be easy. There's not a lot of guys up for trade right now. And you need to land an everyday starter. You need to land someone who is going to be the second or third best player on the team. You need, if you get someone who's the best player on your team, that's better than Lowry and DeRozan. Obviously, that's ideal. It's not realistic, but you need to at minimum, and get an elite 3-point shooter. But then you would still need help in that regard. The most realistic scenario that I think that could improve them significantly is that they land a small forward who would become their third best player. Someone who's better than Ibaka, not as good as DeRozan or Lowry. All that being said, I don't think there's enough out there that's up for trade, and I don't think the Raptors have enough ammunition, stuff that they could offer, that they can land someone that will close the gap between them and Cleveland. But we'll see. They've committed to it now. It's still a long off season. They still have time, but I don't know. Maybe they re-sign those guys now. They let their young guys develop this year, and then next year they go after someone big. They didn't trade much to get Paul George. I would have liked it if they did that, but that's a short-sighted trade, so I'm not too upset about that. But yeah, maybe they just take this year to improve their young guys, improve their core as they gain more chemistry together, and then next year they go after someone big, and then at that point they're ready to compete. I don't know, but if they want to compete this year, it's going to be tough, and I don't know if they can do it. All right, I'm going to take a little bit of a break, and I'll be back in just a moment to talk about the Toronto Blue Jays. All right. Last week I talked a little bit about the Jays with Steven. It was a passing comment. 2 weeks ago, though, me and John had a big segment on the Jays, and I asked him if he thought they still had a shot this season, if he thought that they should be buyers or sellers at the trade deadline, or try to stay the course in order to go for a championship this year. And he said no, he thought they should be sellers. He thought that they should blow up the team by the trade deadline. And I was not ready to commit to that. I thought, at the end of the day, like I said then, you have until July 31st to decide if you're ready. Until July 31st, you can stay the course. And then once that day hits, if you don't think you're ready, then you can unload everyone. So at the time I was like, no, there's too much time. This team is too good to give up on yet. They will turn this around. So a little bit of an update. I've changed my tune on that. I am no longer in, which is unfortunate. Ask yourselves if you think that the Toronto Blue Jays are capable of competing for a World Series this year. Because like I've been saying, if the answer is no, you need to blow up. And the answer is no. Do they have the talent? Absolutely, but they haven't showed it this year. Right? If you look at, on paper, if you look at their rotation, if you look at their lineup, this team is good enough to compete. Their championship window was supposed to last at least one more year, being this year. At least this year. And there was no reason to think that they weren't going to be good enough to make that a reality. 1 through 9. Even with Travis out, 1 through 9. It's a good lineup. Not the best in baseball, but it's a good lineup. They had the best starting rotation in baseball last year. The only difference this year is that Sanchez has been hurt for most of the time, but Biagini's been a suitable replacement. Now, He hasn't been Sanchez. He usually pitches like 5 innings, but he's been good enough. Their bullpen actually, I don't know if it's been better, but it hasn't been that bad. Lately, it's been bad, but like at the beginning of the season, it wasn't that bad. But they're just not consistently performing how they should. How they should. That's a weird thing we say in sports. Not they should do this, they should be this, they should be that. But Troy Tulowitzki should be hitting over 250. Right? Donaldson should be hitting closer to 300. I know he's probably hurt. That's the one guy that he's probably hurting right now, and that's why he's not performing the way he usually is, because that guy was too consistently good the last 2 years at everything to be struggling as much as he is, right? He's starting to turn around right now, but just before the All-Star game, but yeah. No. Most guys are not. Marco Estrada should be like his ERA should be in the 2s, not the 4s. His ERA is almost 500. Like, so anyway, despite the team being talented enough to turn this around, they've dug themselves too big of a hole to risk it. In my opinion. In my opinion, now if I was in the head office for the Blue Jays, it's set in stone. We're blowing up, no matter what happens. Even if after the All-Star game they go on like a 10-game win, well, I mean, maybe that would change it a bit, but still, it's pretty much set in stone because they're in such a big hole that you can't risk, banking on them coming out of it. It would take a Herculean whatever effort for them to get into the postseason, and even if they were to overcome all this, they're 5 games out of it right now. They have been performing consistently well all season. They had a good May, but even then, still inconsistent. Even if they were to somehow turn all that around, which would be very hard, and it would come right down to the wire, and I mean, not blowing up this team means you're saying we're going to have to sit through a few months of them potentially being horrible and missing out on the playoffs by a long shot and not doing anything about it, not doing anything to build the future when we could have. But even if they were to overcome all that and make the playoffs, they're too inconsistent to be trustworthy in the playoffs. The inconsistency problem has been a thing since last year, right? They were decent at first, then they were really good, then they were really, really good, then they were dog shit in September, let's be honest. They were horrible in September last year. Then they slip into the playoffs. They were the division leaders for most of the end of the season. They lose in September, slip in as a wild card team, win one of the best wild card games ever, and then sweep the Rangers. Unbelievable. The Jays from 2015 came back and played the Rangers in the first round. Swept them. Looked great every game. And then they go into Cleveland and just get absolutely shut down. And I understand Cleveland had a good bullpen. Cleveland was obviously a very good team. They went to the World Series last year and were within 1 game of winning the World Series. So obviously they were a great team. But how many times did the Jays face non-starters and were still unable to score runs in that series? Even against, what's that dumbass's name? Trevor Bauer, who cut his finger on the drone. He gets pulled in the first inning or second inning because his finger's bleeding, and they still can't. I don't care how good a bullpen is. If you're in the playoffs and the starter gets pulled in the first 2 innings, you have to put up runs. But they didn't. So that's what I'm talking about. With the inconsistency has been a thing since last September, pretty much, or last playoffs at least. So even if they were to overcome all that, do you really trust them in the playoffs? Look at them now, man. This past series with the Astros, the best team in baseball, despite all the struggles that the Jays have had, like over June, pretty much since Devin Travis got hurt, they beat the best team in baseball, and they lose, and they win, and then they lose 19-1. Like, it's I don't know. This team would not shock me if they won 15 in a row right now and got back in the playoff run, and it wouldn't shock me if they followed that up losing 10 in a row. It wouldn't shock me if they go on this amazing run and win the division and then get swept in the first round. Like, nothing would shock me with this team anymore, besides a World Series win, because this is not the team anymore. They had a shot at it last year. They had probably their best shot at it 2 years ago, which is sad because, at the end of that you think, well, they can do it next year. But the window's closed. So, let's say they do go into sell mode for this year's trade deadline, which should make it exciting for like 5 seconds and then depressing for the rest of the season. But let's say the Blue Jays do go into sell mode. Who's tradable? Almost everyone, right? Let's go through the list, though. The first part of the list is players that you do not listen to offers on. These guys are unmovable. No matter what happens, you do not trade them. I don't care what is offered. Like, in sports, there's this saying that no one's untradeable, that you listen to offers on anyone. And, technically speaking, if the the Angels offer 2 prospects and Mike Trout for any of these guys, obviously I'm going to take it. But, anything that's even remotely realistic, I'm not listening to. So this is the first part of the list are the untradeable players for the Toronto Blue Jays as we begin the rebuild, as we begin the unloading season, where they load up for the future. So first off, you have Marcus Stroman and Aaron Sanchez. These are 2 essential building blocks for your rotation, right? Your focus, right? You have 2 very young pitchers who have already become 2 of the best starting pitchers in the American League. So that's not something you mess with. Again, especially because of their age, right? You need to focus on having those 2 guys as 2 of your starters for a long, long time. Those are your building blocks for the starting rotation. If those guys are your number 1 and 2 pitchers for the next 10 years, you're happy. Okay? So I do not touch those guys. You need to build your starting rotation around something. Again, it doesn't matter how good your farm system is. 1, prospects don't always work out when they get called up. And 2, you need guys that you know are the real deal, right? Even Vlad Guerrero Jr. looks like he's going to be an all-star. This guy looks like he's going to be amazing. He's only 18 years old, and he's already the best prospect that the Jays have. That guy looks like but he can come up to the majors and be horrible. It probably won't happen. Again, he's a pretty amazing prospect, but anything can happen. You don't know until they actually start their career in the majors. And Stroman and Sanchez, we know, are good pitchers. The next unmovable piece, Roberto Osuna. Now, any of these guys I'm listing right now for trade value wise that are unmovable, you can get an amazing return on. If you trade Sanchez, you can get an amazing return. If you trade Stroman, amazing return. If you trade Osuna, you can probably get the biggest return. Let's talk about Roberto Osuna for a second. I'm starting to think he's already the best closer in baseball, and he's only 22 years old. 22 years old. John has already convinced me that he probably is the best closer. Can you name anyone that's better? Anyone out of the bullpen in the entire... in all of baseball that's better than Roberto Osuna right now? You look at this, he's been I've said the word consistent so many times, but he has been the definition of consistent the last 3 years since his rookie year, okay? But then you look at this season. Outside of missing the first week and a half due to injury, and then struggling when he got back, he's been as close to perfect as you can. Since he really recovered from the injury, he hasn't blown a save. He barely gives up a hit. When he gets on the mound, the game is over. Like, it's scary. He's a phenom. He truly is. He's a phenom. So, on one hand, you can get a massive return on him. You can get a bunch of prospects and good players. You can get a huge return on Roberto Osuna. Or, you can have the best, most dominant relief pitcher in baseball for the next close to 20 years. Personally, I'll take the latter. Like, the value, yes, you will get a huge return on Osuna, but there's a reason for that, and that's because the value on having someone as good as he is at the position that he plays, at the age that he is, at only being 22 years old, yeah. That, like, he's irreplaceable. Doesn't matter what you get back for him, you won't be able to replace that. You build your bullpen around Roberto Osuna, you don't trade him. He is untouchable. Offensively, Devin Travis is the only guy on the Toronto Blue Jays that I would say is untouchable. Now, you can't really trade him right now anyway, just because he's hurt. But I'm saying in general, like this list is for like let's say everyone was healthy on July 31st. Devin Travis joins the list of people who are untouchable. He's the guy you build your offense around. Yes, he's injury prone. And yes, he's missed a bunch of time over the last 3 years. But I've seen enough over those last 3 years to tell me that this guy is going to be an elite second baseman offensively for years to come. Like, defensively, he's not that bad. He's not bad at all. People thought he'd be a liability defensively and he'd have to switch over to DH or first base at some point in his career. But he's actually been an above-average second baseman, or at least he was this year, right? But despite his struggles in April, he carried this team. The only time that this team looked like they were as good as they were supposed to be was in May, and he was the driving force behind that. I mean, Jose Bautista also had like an amazing month as well, but the driving force behind that month was Devin Travis. This guy is a 300 hitter. He hits the ball to opposite field. He hits a lot of doubles. He could be your leadoff guy. He's probably better suited as a number 2 in the lineup. Like, Devin Travis is your guy. The Jays front office since Anthopoulos left has actually been doing a great job of rebuilding the Jays farm system. You know, I wrote that article about how Anthopoulos kind of screwed that up a little bit, but considering what happened to the team in the past before they got here, they've actually done a really good job of rebuilding the farm system, but they're going to need established guys to play with once those prospects are ready. And remember, they're not going to be ready for a little while, right? They have a lot of good prospects, but that farm system took a hit in the Anthopoulos era. They're not going to be ready for a few years. Like I said, Vlad Guerrero Jr., who is, you know, the team's number 1 prospect and will most likely be their guy in the future, is only 18. Not even close to being ready. Plus, not every prospect works out. So you need established guys to build around, and Travis is your guy. Offensively, Travis is your guy to build around. He's the guy of the future. He's going to have to stick through 2 or 3 years of the team being mediocre until the prospects are all ready, and they can go all in again and trade for some guys and be ready to compete for a championship. Last but not least on your untouchable list. Now, this guy doesn't really fit the bill of the last few. I mean, we talked about potentially the best closer in baseball at 22 years old. We talked about 2 borderline elite starting pitchers who have the potential to be elite starting pitchers for a long time. And we talked about Devin Travis, who I believe may already be, well, for sure, when he gets back on the field, this guy will be an elite second baseman offensively. He's going to be a multiple-time Silver Slugger winner. So this next guy might not fit in that category with those guys, but I'm going to put him on the untradeable list anyway. That's Joe Biagini. Look, he's young, and he's proven that he can be an effective starter. This is his first year as a starter, so he's probably only going to get better. And he's great out of the bullpen. There's too much value in that, right? like at the end of the day, the only reason Biagini's on the untradeable list is because you have so many guys who are trade pieces that you can trade, that you can say no, we're gonna hang on to Biagini, we're gonna let him develop and see what we really have in him, because we don't know yet. He was he's back in the bullpen now, but as a starter, he was like your prototypical like fifth starter, right? But this is his first time. This year was his first time as a starter, and he only did it after working out of the bullpen for a bit when a few pitchers went down with injuries. So he has room to grow as a starter. And out of the bullpen, the last 2 years, he's been one of their best relief pitchers. So even if his future is in the bullpen, which it most likely isn't, he's proven that he can be a great setup man or a great mid-relief guy, right? Who can eat up multiple innings because he's been a starting pitcher before. A lot of value in that alone. But he can also be a good starting pitcher. Now, I don't think he has the potential to be an elite starting pitcher, but again, he has the potential to be a good one. He could be a third, fourth, or a great fifth starter. But we don't know yet with him, and I'm willing to find out. So I would put him on the untradeable list as well. The next guy on the list, or the next section of the list, is guys that I would think about. So these aren't untouchable, but they're also not, for sure you got to trade them. These are, I don't know, it's got to be the right offer. First one is Justin Smoak. Now, I have thought about putting him on the former list. I've thought about putting him on the later list, actually. But I think he is what this part of the list is kind of made for, right? The thing with Justin Smoak is if you or I, or if we were completely sure that what he's done so far this season was anywhere near sustainable, he'd for sure be on the previous list. He'd be an untouchable. But he only has half a season of success to show for his career so far, right? Like Michael Saunders did the same thing last year. Michael Saunders was a 300 hitter who snuck into the All-Star game at the last second. And then look how he turned out, right? He was brutal in the second half of the season, had a decent playoff showing, signed with Seattle if I'm not mistaken, and then he's since been released and then re-signed to the Jays on a minor league contract. Like one half season of hitting 300 and hitting some home runs and making the All-Star game does not guarantee that is the guy. Like there's a lot of potential there for him to go back to his old ways, right? Maybe he's just having a really extended hot streak. However, Smoak is not Saunders. Smoak has always had the power. He's always been a good power hitter, and he was once a good prospect. So personally, I'd rather the team wait on Smoak and see what they have in him. See if they have another guy to build the offense around besides Travis. Maybe build it around Travis and Smoak. But with the right offer, you have to do it. Like, he's hitting 300 this season. He's already hit over 20 home runs. He's good defensively, albeit at first base. And he's got a really nice contract, only $4.5 million a year. Like, $4.5 million a year for what he's doing, and that's a steal, right? But his trade value all depends on what teams think he's, like, whether teams think he's coming to his own. Like, this is who he is. I mean, he's not that young. Actually, I was shocked to find out that he's actually 30 years old. I thought he was younger. 30 years old. Like, is he one of those guys like Josh Donaldson who comes into their own later in their career? Because, again, he was a good prospect when he was younger, right? And that makes you think that maybe, okay, what scouts saw in him back then is now finally surfacing. That makes you more comfortable that he's having a late career resurgence instead of he's just having an extended hot streak. But at the end of the day, it's too early to tell whether he is. I don't think he'll sustain hitting 300 over his career, but over the rest of his career. But whether he is this very good first baseman who hits a lot of home runs and has a good average, right? or if he's just like really seeing the ball well, because he can crash and burn any second. So personally, if I'm the Jays, I would wait. I would hang on to him. The risk is that if he does crash and burn this season, you'll never get a good offer on him, or as good an offer as you would have if you traded him today or tomorrow. But I'm willing to find out. Again, you have so many guys that you can trade that I'm willing to wait and find out with him. At the same time, you can get a pretty nice offer for him. Like, yes, there's no telling when he'll crash and burn, but he's an all-star. He's hitting 300, over 20 home runs. For a team that's looking to get over the hump, that's some friggin' good value. And if he works out long-term, like, the upside in trading for Justin Smoke is high. There's a lot of upside in trading for Justin Smoke. If you're a team who's on the fringe of the playoffs, or is in the playoffs, but just looking for that extra ammunition to ensure a championship, you're getting a guy who will help you this season and has the potential to continue to do so over the next few years on a very affordable contract. I think you can sell that to some teams. I think there are a lot of teams that are willing to take the risk, especially because of the contract. So I think they're willing to give up a few prospects for that. So again, if you get a really nice offer for Justin Smoke, probably do it, just because the risk is that he'll crash and burn. But unless you get that really, really nice trade offer, I would wait to see if he's the guy that you build, your offense around Travis and Smoke, and then fill in the gaps with your prospects and guys that you later on sign, whatever. Another guy is Kevin Pillar. That would fit onto this list. Look, when you talk about elite defensive talent, that's Kevin Pillar, right? That's why I thought about putting one on the previous list of guys who are untouchable. But the more I think about it, the less I feel that way. He's the second best outfielder he's the second best outfielder in baseball, and that's something that will make him valuable anywhere he goes for a long time, regardless of how he struggles offensively. He's got a lot of speed on the bases. He actually he's a pretty dumb base runner, to be honest, but he's got speed. So that'll add to his value a bit. So he's not the kind of guy you have to trade. But his tendency to he strikes out so much. Man, it's so sad because he had such a good start to the season. Like, in April, he was the only guy producing. Halfway through May, he was continuing to hit around 300. He was our leadoff hitter. And then, he drops off. At the end of the day, he's there for his defense, so it wasn't a big deal. Like, if he kept hitting the way he was, then you definitely can't trade him, right? Although if you do, you get a nice return. But I don't know. I would think about putting him in the untradeable list just because his defense is so good. You won't ever replicate it with anyone else. But the fact that he's such a one-dimensional player that he can't hit, and he strikes out so often, means that if you get the right offer for him, you can trade him. I mean, a lot of their prospects are outfielders anyway, right? So if you get offered enough, you might pull the trigger on him. Alright, let's get to the juicy part of this list. These are the big trading pieces. These are the guys that you can trade that will, if you're blowing up, you absolutely do trade, that you'll get like a big return on, or the biggest return on. So first on that list is obviously Josh Donaldson. Like, this is one of those things that I know a lot of Jays fans don't want to be done, but if you're rebuilding, it has to be done. Despite his recent struggles, he's one of the best players in all of baseball, right? I mean, this guy won an MVP 2 years ago. He's elite both. He's elite offensively and defensively. And he's in the prime of his career. He's 31 years old. Prime of his career. This guy, again, he's struggling right now. I really think that he's too good to be struggling for anything other than the injury that he came back from, right? But you think he's 31 years old. He's already proven he can sustain the success over a long period of time by winning an MVP 2 years ago and being an MVP candidate last year. And the year before he won MVP, he was also an MVP candidate with Oakland. Okay? He hits around 300. He hits a lot of home runs. Last year he hit close to 40. He's a great base runner. Like, he's not going to steal a ton of bases, but he'll steal some bases, and he's very, very smart on the bases. And he's great defensively. Like, he's literally the perfect third baseman. So simply put, the fact that you can get a king's ransom for Donaldson, coupled with the fact that his play is almost guaranteed to decline by the time that you're ready to be a powerhouse again, it makes him a must-trade if you're blowing up. Like, he's going to be good for another 4 or 5 years, but by the time this team's ready to be good again with their prospects, Donaldson will either be worse or about to get worse. He'll be on that slow decline. So you have to trade him. Because, again, you'll get a lot in return. You'll get too much in return for him not to trade him when he won't be able to contribute much when you're actually good again. I mean, trading an MVP is a big deal. For teams that want to compete, landing Josh Donaldson is massive for the short term and long term of your team. He'll help you compete for a championship this year and the year after that and the year after that, and then you have to try to re-sign him. Like, you'll get a massive return on him, and you have to do it. Because unlike with Osuna, it's not as long, it doesn't hurt you long term as much. But again, I'm saying all these good things about him. The difference between his trade value and some of the other guys I talked about is that, that tagline, if you get the right offer, I've used it a lot today. With Donaldson, you'll get the right offer. Like, there's no doubt. If you put Donaldson up for trade, you will get the right offer. You will get a lot in return. Guaranteed. So I think he's a must-trade if you're blowing up. And you look at some pitchers. You got J.A. Happ. So despite his most recent game, Happ's been pretty stellar this season. Very low-key, but he's been pretty good. He won 20 games last year, and by pitching well again this year, he's a prime candidate to get shipped off to a team that's ready for a playoff push, right? That wants a little extra help. You can never have enough pitchers, right? You might not get a massive return on Happ, but considering he's 34 years old and you're looking at the future, getting a nice, a solid return for a lefty pitcher would be more than worth it, right? Happ can't be in your long-term plan because he's 34. But for this season, there's a lot of value for other teams that are looking to trade for someone, that are looking for a playoff push, and getting a solid left-handed pitcher who's very experienced, who's pitched in the playoffs, and is pitching well. Actually, at 34, the last season was the best season of his career, right? There's so much value in Happ. He's consistent, despite having a bad game in his last game. He's consistent, so lots of value in trading for J.A. Happ. One of those guys that, there's no long-term, there's no hurting the team by trading J.A. Happ if you're the Jays. So it'll hurt you this season. Well, you're already out of it this year. If you're deciding to blow up, you've decided that you're not good enough this year. And trading Happ will only really hurt you this year, maybe next year. So you have to trade him. Next you have Jose Bautista, which it's another one I understand a lot of fans won't want to do. I don't want them to trade Jose Bautista. He's the greatest player I've ever seen in a Jays uniform, right? He's defined this last era of Jays baseball, including the bad years and the good years, right? But teams that need an experienced bat in the playoffs, like I just said with Happ, if you're the Jays, you can't have guys past 33 in your long-term plans, right? Like Jose Bautista's 36. At the end of the day, I mean, I was talking about how Donaldson will probably get worse by the time the young prospects get good and your team is ready to be a powerhouse again and a contender again. Bautista will be retired by then. There's no doubt that he'll be gone by the time you're ready to be a good team. But it's on a 1-year contract. There is literally no reason not to trade Bautista this year if you're blowing up. Right? So he really has no value to you if you're done. But for other teams, again, any team can use an experienced bat in the playoffs. Bautista's been there before. He's shown that he doesn't shy away from the moment. He hits home runs, he gets on base consistently. And he's on a 1-year deal, so teams don't have to worry about his contract or his age. Like, if you're looking for an outfielder or someone to play DH or first base that has the bat that Bautista does, you don't have to look at him and say, oh, but he's 36. Like, shit, that's not going to work. It doesn't matter. His contract's up at the end of the season, which means you don't have to commit to him long term. You trade for him to give you a push this playoffs, and that's it. See you later, right? So much value in him for a playoff team. Again, he hits a lot of home runs. He walks a lot, despite what a lot of people will tell you that are Jays fans that for some reason don't like Bautista. He's actually having a pretty decent season. Like, he's not having a season that he had 2 years ago when he was one of the best players in baseball and an MVP candidate. But he is having a good season. His average is around 250, but his OBP is way higher. Like, his OBP is good. And he's still hitting his home runs. He gets on base a lot. It's useful. Considering that even if you do trade him, you can I don't think it would happen, but there's a possibility that you can re-sign him at the end of the season anyway. Yeah. I will take a prospect or two in return for that. So he's a must-trade if you're blowing up. Then you got Marco Estrada. The problem with Marco Estrada is that his trade value is plummeting with every outing that he has. Like, he was such a sure-handed... If you told me in April that they'd be in the position they are right now where they need to blow up, I would have had Marco Estrada at the top of this list right beside Josh Donaldson. Like, just below Josh Donaldson. Because he was consistent. Like, the definition of consistent... Every single game he was between good and great. And all of his starts. Like, he just didn't have bad performances. It was either good, like, 6 innings, gave up 3 runs. 2 or 3 runs was good. Or it was like lights out. 8 innings, 1 run. He's had a few of those this year, but he's had like way too many bad outings. The last month has just been horrible to Marco Estrada. He has been bad, very uncharacteristically bad as well. So, but his best performances may have come in the last 2 years in the playoffs. So, I don't know. At the end of the day, his trade value is pretty low right now. And he doesn't have that much time to turn it around. Like, he would have to have a few solid starts in a row to get his trade value anywhere near where it was before. He'd have to convince people that this last stretch was done and that he was back to being the Estrada of the last 2 years. Because that Estrada would have a lot of value on the trade market. He's not too old. He's a free agent this year, so you don't have to commit to him long term, just like Bautista. And again, every team could use good pitchers, especially one that's consistent and that has risen to the occasion in the playoffs every year, had his best performances in the playoffs. But he can't have a bad outing before July 31st now. He's actually another prime candidate like Bautista I don't think Bautista would, but I could see Estrada re-signing if they trade him July 31st. I can see him coming back next year. Getting shipped off to a contender this year, seeing how that works out, then he's a free agent and resigns with the Jays again, because he really likes in Toronto. But he's a must-trade. Even if you don't get much in return for him, considering that he's a free agent, you have to trade him. Even if you just get a shitty prospect out of it, you got to trade him for whatever you can get. Because at the end of the day, if you don't, you're not getting anything is good. So, yeah. Then you have Kendrys Morales. This one I wasn't really sure where to put on this list. He doesn't have a bad contract. It's like a 3-year deal, just over 10 mil. Like, it's not outrageous or anything, especially for what he's producing. He is what he is. He can't play defense. He's a DH. He can play first base. First base is the least important position defensively, so he's fine at first base. He hits a lot of home runs. He's got a decent average. His OPP is a little lower than what I would have expected. He is like 33. So, it's not the longest contract. It's only 3 years, but it's not the best. It's just that they just signed him this offseason, so I don't know if they'd be willing to trade him off. I don't know. I mean, if it's me, I would definitely trade him and get any value out of him that you can if you're willing to blow up. But I don't know if they're willing to. So he's kind of like an outlier, I think. And then you got guys like Francisco Liriano, Ezekiel Carrera, Ryan Goins, Darwin Barney, anyone that pitches out of the bullpen other than Osuna and Biagini, that you obviously trade them if you get an offer. Like, I don't have to say that. You know that. You won't get much for them, but an injury-riddled team that's in the hunt can use a guy like Liriano or Carrera or Goins. That's what the Jays did the last 2 years. They traded for, actually, like, Barney was one of those moves. Liriano was one of those moves where they, the Jays were in the hunt and they traded for those guys. They gave up nothing for them, but whatever. So if you can get anything out of those guys, yeah, obviously you trade them. If you're in sell mode, of course. There's no argument against it, but I don't need to say that. And the last part of the list contains 2 people. Now, both of these people are not, both of these players are great. It's just the contracts. So they're impossible to move. These are 2 guys that you would like to trade, but you're probably not able to, right? So the first one I have here is Russell Martin. I'm not ready to completely say it's impossible to move Martin. Me and John actually had this argument the other day. He thinks it's completely impossible to trade Martin. I'm not ready to say that yet. Because the thing with Russell Martin, despite his age and despite his contract, he's an elite catcher, both offensively and defensively, with a ton of experience. I mean, a ton of experience. This guy's made it to the playoffs 12 times. I think he's only missed the playoffs 2 times in his career. And he's been in the MLB a long time. There's so much value in Russell Martin. It's hard enough to find a good catcher. There's a lot of teams that could use a good catcher out there. But it's even harder to find a catcher who's elite defensively and can contribute offensively. People are really over-exaggerating about the season Martin's having. He's having a great season. For a catcher to get on base as often as he has, don't look at average, man. Look at OBP. And he hits the occasional dinger, too. And he's another one of those guys that, he plays at a certain level, and then he'll see streaks where he's not very good. Unfortunately, he hit the last 2 years in the playoffs, he kind of got worn out. Catchers do get a lot of wear and tear, so it makes sense that they get worse at the end of the season. So he wasn't hitting very well in the last 2 years in the playoffs. But he also, he's a streaky player. He gets really hot, and when he gets hot, man, last year in August, he was their best player. I think people forget that a little bit. He started to slow down in September, and then he was offensively, he was kind of trash in the playoffs. But, man, in August last year, he was raking, right? I just think there's so much value in Russell Martin, but his contract will make it really tough to trade him. Again, he's not one of those guys that, he's no longer in your long-term plans, right? Because he's 34, 33 years old, something like that. He's owed $20 million this season. He's owed $20 million next season, and he's owed $20 million a year after. It's a pretty hefty price to pay, $20 million, especially when the last year of his contract is, like he's 36 years old that year. So you'll be paying a guy $20 million when he's 36. That's why it's hard to move Martin. Unlike guys like Bautista, who can produce for you right now, but you don't have to commit to them, Martin, you're locked in there, and you're locked in there to give him a lot of money for the next 3 years. Well, this year and then 2 years, so for the next 2 years, I guess. I don't know. It's just so rare to find a catcher as good as Martin. Every team can use, like, catcher is so important, and there aren't that many good catchers. There are so many teams that could use a guy like that are good. I still think it's possible that they can trade Martin. It's just that if they do trade Martin, don't be shocked if the return on him isn't great at all. Like, don't be shocked if it's just a salary cap dump. A team that's willing to compete, or that is in it for a World Series this year says, you know what, screw it. We'll take on his contract if it gets us a World Series. We're not giving you anything in return. And the Jays say, fine, we have some cap space for the next few years. So, I wouldn't be shocked if they traded him. I'd be surprised, because it's going to be hard to move that contract. But I'm not going to say it's impossible just yet. There's just too much value in Russell Martin. But, 3 years left on his contract, including this one, all at $20 million. That's a lot to pay for a rental. So it would be tough. But yeah, if they did get it done, it would be a salary cap dump. They won't get anything in return, but they'll free up space for the future. So, and then last but not least on this list of guys who are untradeable, impossible to move, you have Troy Tulowitzki. And this one's unmovable. Tulo is owed $20 million for this year, $20 million for the year after, $20 million for the year after that. It's the same as Martin in that sense. But then the year after that, he's owed $14 million, and then the year after that, he's owed $15 million. So whereas Martin is 3 years, including this year, Tulo's is 5, including this year. However, that last year, thankfully, is a club option. For those of you who don't know what a club option is, it means that the team has the right to either pick up the contract for its final year or terminate it on the spot. So you can rid yourself of Tulo if it's that much of an issue in that last season. But that's still a lot of money locked in for the next 3 seasons past this one. It's not exactly a rental player. If you trade for him, he plays for you the rest of this season and then the next 3, guaranteed. And I'm talking $20 million a season. It dips down to $14 million, which is still pretty high. And then you have the option to pay him $15 million if you want a 5th year out of it. Now, Tulowitzki's only 32 years old, which is kind of shocking if you think about how long he's been around. But that's the thing. He's been around for a long, long time. Like, he made his debut at age 21, which means he's had some wear and tear. It's probably, if anything could explain his declining play, it's wear and tear, right? He's been around for a long time. So, yeah, he's not exactly old, but it's not about, well, a lot of people forget, it's not about age, right? It's about how long they've been there, how long they've been playing, how long the sport has really eaten away at their body. He's still pretty much elite defensively, but he's not as sure-handed as he once was. Like, he's not the Tulo where it's like a ball goes towards him, he's grabbing it. Again, he's still pretty much elite. It's just he's not perfect like he used to be defensively. Offensively, he can still produce, but not even close to as well as he used to. He's now a below 250 hitter, like barely. And I'm not just talking about average. Like, his OBP is low as well. If I'm not mistaken, his OBP is below 300, which is not good. So he's a below 250 hitter who hits occasional home runs, which is a far cry from the 300 hitter who was mashing around 30 home runs before, right? Like, the fact that at 32 he's already significantly declined. Like, Martin hasn't really declined. Martin might have a big contract and 2 more years of $20 million, but at least he's still an elite catcher in the MLB. Tulo has already started to decline, and it's not just this season. Like, I think people over-exaggerate how bad he was last season because I think people forget that in the second half of the season, he was one of their best players. Remember how I said Martin carried them in August? Tulo was their only good player in September, and he was their second best player in August, right? But despite how underratedly, because remember, he started off hitting like 150 in April, slightly improved in May, then got hurt, came back and had a good June, and then had a great August and a great September, right? But despite how good he played last year, it still wasn't as good as Colorado Tulo. Like, he's never really been Colorado Tulo. Like, he hasn't put up the same numbers in Toronto as he did in Colorado since he got traded here. So, but this year was like, is he gonna be that guy again, or is he close to it? And this year's like a significant decline in play. He could still snap out of it, but even if he does snap out of it, you look at his 2.5 years in Toronto. Like if by the end of the season he ends up having a pretty good one, you look at his 2.5 years in Toronto, and you'll be looking at a pretty inconsistent player, which is not worth the contract that they're paying him, right? So no one's taking that contract that has that many years on it and that much money on it when the guy isn't nearly as good as he was when he signed it. So yeah, this team needs to improve for the future. Even if you think they can make a push, even if you think this team is good enough to compete this year, there's no argument for trading any big prospects this year. That's out of the question. I saw a rumor that they're trying to trade for D. Gordon, which is interesting because they do need a second baseman. Ryan Goins is not an everyday second baseman. Neither is Darwin Barney. But they're no longer in a position where they can trade prospects for good players because, I mean, if they don't win it this year, they're already in a bad place right now because they were buyers 2 years ago at the deadline. 2 years ago they were buyers, and already they're starting to feel the effects of it without a championship to show for it. So they definitely can't be buyers now, even if you think they're ready to make a push, which I don't think they are. If anything, if you think they can make a push, then they have to just stick with it, grind through it, see if this team can work it out and make the playoffs, but I doubt they have that capability right now. The other option, obviously, is to just start trading away expiring contracts, aging players, anyone that you can get a significant return on who is not necessarily there for the next era of Jays baseball, right? Who's not going to be a big part of that. It sucks. Honestly, it sucks because this team, this core that we're currently seeing on the field this year, is the team that got this city hyped up for baseball again. Right? Toronto baseball, they missed the playoffs 22 years in a row, right? Like, Toronto baseball was kind of getting stale. People just expected mediocrity. Attendance-wise, man, they were struggling. They had some bad years. They saw a spike when Anthopoulos made those big trades in 2013, and then it started to go down again. Right? Now, Jays games are selling out all the time, but, it was bad for a while. So we waited so long for this. We waited so long, and now we finally got this team who finally gave us entertaining baseball again, who got the city excited about baseball again. Turn this back into a baseball city, because, Christ, we were a hockey city for so long when our team sucked. But at the end of the day, this team was built for short-term success. It was not built for long-term. Anthopoulos sold out because he thought the team could win immediately. He gave them what seemed like a 3-year window. They failed to win it in the first 2. They came close, but they didn't make the finals both years. And now it looks like it might have been only a 2-year window because July 31st is coming up, and right now it looks like they need to be sellers. It looks like, and when they start selling, that's the end of the window, obviously. It sucks, but it's time to start over. Alright, I don't want to end on that depressing note. So, for you Toronto fans out there, just for some optimism to end off the podcast, I'm going to just remind you that you have another team in the city, this is such a change. We went from all the teams sucking to the Raptors being good, to the Raptors and Jays being good, with the Leafs being like, the redheaded stepchild, they sucked, to now the Leafs are the team you get excited about. So I just want to remind you, we do have a team to be excited about. The Leafs are good. Leafs can win a Stanley Cup this year and I wouldn't be shocked, and they're going to win within the next 2 years. If they don't win this year, which I don't think they will win the year after that. Guarantee it. I made that bet with Steven last week on the podcast. But I'm just gonna list off the Leafs starting lineup on paper right now, if I were to make the lineup. Just to give you some optimism as I step out. First line, left wing, Patrick Marleau. Center, Austin Matthews. Right wing, William Nylander. Second line, James Van Riemsdyk, Tyler Bozak, Mitch Marner. Third line, Leo Komarov, Nazem Kadri, Connor Brown. Fourth line, Zach Hyman, Dominic Moore, Kasperi Kapanen. That's pretty unreal. Alright. So on that positive note, thank you once again for listening to the podcast. Make sure you check out my blog at www.mediocresportstalk.wordpress.com for more posts. Just put out a pretty fire post, if I do say so myself, about Dana White and how he treats his fighters in the UFC, so check that out. And make sure you come back next week for another edition of Mediocre Sports Talk podcast, courtesy of Daniel Marino.